Dearest listeners, there exists in this world a peculiar paradox, that society, which professes to admire virtue above all else, will condemn the most virtuous act if it appears cloaked in scandal. Today, your humble chronicler brings you the most extraordinary tale of sacrifice and redemption, wherein a young woman of impeccable character chose disgrace to save another, and the most powerful duke in England discovered that true nobility resides not in bloodlines, but in the human heart. But let us not rush through such a tale as this, for the best stories, like the finest Madeira, must be savored properly. The spring of 1816 found the Fairfax family in circumstances that could only be described as genteel poverty, that most agonizing of social positions wherein one possessed all the breeding of the aristocracy with none of its accompanying wealth. Sir Edmund Fairfax, the fifth baronet of an ancient but impoverished line, maintained a modest establishment in Bloomsbury, far removed from the fashionable squares of Mayfair where his ancestors had once resided. The family fortune, never considerable, had been decimated by the late Lady Fairfax's medical expenses during her prolonged illness, and what remained had been further eroded by Sir Edmund's unfortunate investments in a canal scheme that had proved as watery in profits as in its intended purpose. Miss Diana Fairfax, at 22, understood her position with the clarity that comes from watching one's father count coins at the breakfast table. She was the eldest of 2 daughters, blessed with neither fortune nor extraordinary beauty, though she possessed what the charitable termed handsome features: intelligent gray eyes that missed nothing, a determined chin, and a tall, commanding figure that made her stand out in drawing rooms for reasons not entirely advantageous to a young woman seeking matrimony. Her dark hair, which refused to curl fashionably despite the most determined applications of hot irons, was usually dressed simply, and her gowns, though scrupulously maintained, showed the unfortunate tendency of fabric to betray its age through the telltale signs of multiple alterations and careful mending. The Tun, with its characteristic mixture of admiration and mockery, had bestowed upon her the sobriquet of the Leona after an evening at the opera when she had publicly defended a friend from the cutting remarks of a patroness of Almack's. Diana had faced down the formidable matron with such composed ferocity that the comparison to a lioness had seemed inevitable. Some meant it as a compliment to her courage, others wielded it as a subtle insult to her unmarried state and lack of feminine softness. Diana herself cared little for either interpretation. She had long since learned that survival in the marriage mart required a thick skin and a practical mind. Her sister, Miss Harriet Fairfax, presented an entirely different picture. At 19, Harriet possessed the kind of delicate, ethereal beauty that poets praised and sensible mothers feared. Golden curls framed a face of classical proportions, and her blue eyes held a dreamy quality that gentlemen found enchanting and Diana found worrying. Where Diana had inherited their father's pragmatism and their mother's strength, Harriet had received only their mother's romantic disposition without the tempering influence of common sense. She read novels with the fervor of a devotee, believed in true love with unshakable conviction, and trusted in the goodness of others with a naivety that made Diana's protective instincts surge with almost maternal intensity. The season of 1816 represented the family's last desperate gamble for respectability. Sir Edmund, through the intervention of a distant cousin, had secured vouchers for Almack's for both daughters, and he had mortgaged what little remained unencumbered to provide them with gowns and slippers suitable for appearing in polite society. The plan, never articulated but universally understood, required at least one daughter to make a respectable match with a gentleman of adequate means. Diana, being the elder and the practical one, understood that this duty fell primarily to her, though her prospects were limited by her age, her fortune, and her unfortunate reputation for possessing opinions. It was during their 3rd week of the season that disaster had begun to unfurl its dark wings over the Fairfax household, though Diana had not recognized the danger until it was nearly too late. Harriet, who had been enjoying modest success among the second sons and younger gentlemen of the Tun, had attracted the particular attention of Mr. Geoffrey Pemberton, a man whose handsome face and charming manners concealed a character as corrupt as his lineage was impeccable. Pemberton, the third son of an earl, possessed expensive tastes and mounting debts, and he had identified Harriet as the perfect solution to his financial difficulties. Though the Fairfax fortune was negligible, Harriet's beauty would bring him connections, and Sir Edmund's desperation would ensure lenient marriage settlements. Diana had distrusted Pemberton from their first meeting at a musicale in Grosvenor Square. There was something calculating in the way his eyes assessed Harriet, something practiced in his compliments, and something altogether too knowing in his smile. But Harriet, who saw in Pemberton the romantic hero of her novels made flesh, had refused to credit Diana's warnings. She had danced with him twice at a ball at Devonshire House, walked with him in Hyde Park during the fashionable hour, with their maid trailing at a discreet distance, and allowed him to partner her at whist during an evening party at the home of Lady Thornbury. It was after this last occasion that Harriet had returned home with a troubled expression that she attempted to conceal behind forced gaiety. Diana, who knew her sister as well as she knew her own heart, had extracted the truth with gentle persistence. Pemberton had somehow acquired 3 letters that Harriet had written to a childhood friend, letters that contained nothing more scandalous than romantic fantasies and girlish confidences, but which, presented in a certain light to certain people, could be interpreted as evidence of a secret correspondence with a gentleman. In an age where a young woman's reputation rested on foundations as fragile as spun glass, even the appearance of impropriety could shatter matrimonial prospects beyond repair. Pemberton had been explicit in his terms. Harriet would accept his addresses and influence her father to settle what remained of the family estate upon her at marriage, or the letters would find their way to the patronesses of Almack's and the drawing rooms of Mayfair. He had given her 1 week to decide, and that week was rapidly drawing to its close. Diana had spent 3 sleepless nights examining every possible solution. She had considered appealing to their distant cousin, but the man had already done more than familial obligation demanded and possessed, neither the influence nor the inclination to confront a peer's son. She had contemplated stealing the letters, but Pemberton was not fool enough to keep them where they might be easily recovered. She had even briefly considered violence, though she possessed neither the means nor the ruthlessness to carry through such a scheme. In the end, the solution that presented itself was both simple and terrible in its implications. If Diana herself became the subject of a scandal so consuming that it overshadowed any potential whispers about Harriet, if she sacrificed her own reputation so completely that the Ton forgot to care about anyone else, then Harriet would be safe. Pemberton would lose interest in a sister-in-law whose connection brought only shame. The letters would become worthless, for no one would care about the correspondence of a woman whose own sister had fallen into disgrace. The plan had formed in Diana's mind with the inexorable logic of mathematics. She would need to be found in a compromising position with a gentleman of sufficient reputation that society would instantly condemn her. But she would need to ensure that no actual harm came to her person, and that the gentleman in question would not feel obligated to offer marriage. It would require perfect timing, careful witnesses, and a complete disregard for her own future happiness. By a bitter irony, the instrument of her planned downfall was the very man who threatened her sister. On the night of the Beaumont ball, Diana had followed Pemberton into the conservatory, where he had arranged to meet Harriet for a private conversation about her answer to his demands. Diana had intercepted him, informed him that Harriet had taken ill and returned home, and then, with her heart pounding so violently she feared it might escape her chest entirely, she had proceeded to execute her desperate scheme. She had sent a footman to fetch Lady Thornbury, the greatest gossip of the ton, with a message that something extraordinary was occurring in the conservatory. Then she had arranged herself on a stone bench beside Pemberton in a tableau that suggested intimacy without actual impropriety. When Lady Thornbury had arrived with 3 of her closest friends, they had discovered Diana seated so close to Pemberton that scandal was inevitable, her hand resting on his arm, her face tilted toward his in an attitude that suggested either conspiracy or courtship. The explosion of gossip had been immediate and catastrophic. Within 24 hours, every drawing room in London knew that the Leona had been discovered in a compromising position with Geoffrey Pemberton. Speculation ran wild. They were lovers. They were eloping. She had pursued him shamelessly. He had seduced her wickedly. The truth, that she had deliberately courted scandal to save her sister, occurred to no one. Sir Edmund, summoned from his club to face the ruin of his family's name, had been apoplectic with rage and shame. He had demanded explanations that Diana refused to provide, had shouted about disgrace and dishonor, and had finally ordered her from his house with instructions never to return. Diana had packed her meager belongings with hands that trembled only slightly, had embraced a weeping Harriet who understood nothing of what had truly occurred, and had departed for the Bloomsbury house of her maternal aunt, Mrs. Theodora Wainwright, a widow of modest means and generous heart who had offered her niece sanctuary when no one else would. The Duke of Silvermere's London residence on Grosvenor Square stood as a monument to power, wealth, and unassailable social position. Its Portland stone facade gleamed in the afternoon sun. Its numerous windows reflected the sky with aristocratic indifference, and its very existence seemed to rebuke the lesser establishments that surrounded it. Robert Thornbury, 7th Duke of Silvermere, possessed a fortune that made him independent of royal favor, estates that encompassed thousands of acres across 3 counties, and a political influence that made cabinet ministers seek his opinion before proposing legislation. At 35, Silvermere had remained unmarried not from lack of opportunity, but from a fastidiousness carried to such extremes that his peers attributed it to either impossible standards or a cold heart. The truth, had anyone dared to ask him directly, was more prosaic. He had yet to meet a woman whose character matched her accomplishments, whose intelligence equaled her beauty, or whose conversation engaged his mind rather than merely flattering his position. He had observed too many marriages of convenience deteriorate into mutual contempt, and he had resolved that if he must marry to secure the succession, he would at least choose a companion whose presence did not bore him to distraction. The Duke possessed a reputation for coldness that was not entirely undeserved. He spoke seldom but with devastating precision, smiled rarely except in sardonic amusement, and maintained standards of conduct that he applied equally to himself and others, with results that many found intimidating. His gray eyes, so pale they sometimes appeared colorless in certain lights, seemed to perceive pretension with uncomfortable accuracy, and his judgments, once formed, were rarely revised. The Ton called him the Ice Duke behind his back, though never to his face, and mothers of marriageable daughters approached him with the same combination of hope and trepidation they might feel when presenting themselves before royalty. His Grace's carefully ordered world had been disrupted some 6 months earlier by the arrival of his orphan niece, Lady Amelia Thornbury, the daughter of his late younger brother. Amelia, at 16, possessed all the willfulness of youth combined with the trauma of sudden loss. Her parents had perished in a carriage accident on the road to Bath, and she had been transported from a household of affection and indulgence to the austere magnificence of her uncle's establishment with little preparation or ceremony. The Duke, who understood politics and estate management with intuitive brilliance, found himself entirely at a loss when confronted with a grieving, angry adolescent who alternated between tearful withdrawal and outright rebellion. A succession of governesses had attempted to manage Lady Amelia's education and comportment with uniformly disastrous results. The first, a gentlewoman of impeccable references, had resigned after Amelia had deliberately ruined an expensive pianoforte by pouring ink into its mechanism. The second, a sterner individual recommended by a duchess, had lasted 3 weeks before departing in high dudgeon after Amelia had informed her with perfect composure that she would rather die than submit to instruction from a woman whose own marriage prospects had been so negligible that she had been forced into employment. The third had simply vanished one morning, leaving behind a brief note citing nervous exhaustion and a forwarding address in Scotland. It was Silvermere's secretary, Mr. Finch, a man of surprising insight and diplomatic skill, who had suggested an unconventional solution. Rather than hiring another conventional governess who would attempt to mold Amelia through a combination of etiquette lessons and moral lectures, why not engage someone whose own history made her incapable of self-righteousness? Someone who had experienced scandal and survived, who understood that the world was more complex than drawing room proprieties suggested, and who might therefore connect with a young woman whose world had shattered through no fault of her own. Finch had presented his employer with a brief dossier on Miss Diana Fairfax, compiled with discretion by a former Bow Street runner who now handled delicate investigations for select clients. The facts were straightforward. A baronet's daughter, well-educated, aged 2 and 20, currently residing with her aunt in considerably reduced circumstances, and most significantly, subject of a scandal that had destroyed her social standing 3 months earlier. The specifics of the scandal were vague, involving a compromising discovery in a conservatory with a gentleman of questionable character. But the consequences were clear. She had been expelled from her father's house and was now living as little better than a companion to her aunt. Silvermere, reading through the information with his characteristic thoroughness, had found himself intrigued by the notion. A woman who had fallen from grace would possess none of the moral superiority that had made previous governesses so insufferable to Amelia. She would be desperate enough for employment to tolerate his niece's behavior, and grateful enough for the position to perform her duties conscientiously. Moreover, there was a certain poetic justice in exposing Amelia to the real consequences of scandal, in showing her what happened when a woman stepped beyond the boundaries of acceptable conduct. The girl needed practical education more than theoretical precepts, and what could be more practical than daily exposure to the reality of social ruin? The interview had been arranged with careful discretion. Miss Fairfax had been summoned to Grosvenor Square through a letter from Finch that made no mention of the Duke's identity, referring only to a gentleman seeking a companion governess for a young lady of quality. Diana, who had been surviving on her aunt's limited charity and her own needlework for 3 months, had accepted the appointment with a mixture of hope and apprehension. She possessed no illusions about her circumstances. Women in her position had few options beyond marriage, which was now impossible, or employment, which was humiliating but preferable to destitution. She had presented herself at the appointed hour, dressed in a gown of gray merino wool that had once been her best day dress, but now showed unmistakable signs of age and repeated alteration. Her dark hair was dressed simply beneath a modest bonnet, and her gray eyes, meeting the Duke's pale gaze for the first time in the intimidating grandeur of his library, betrayed neither servility nor defiance, only a kind of resigned dignity that intrigued him against his will. Silvermere, observing her from his position behind a massive mahogany desk, noted the straightness of her spine, the intelligence in her expression, and the absence of either flirtation or fear in her demeanor. She neither simpered nor cringed, made no attempt to engage his sympathy or appeal to his better nature, and answered his questions with a directness that he found unexpectedly refreshing. When he had inquired about her circumstances, she had stated simply that she was the daughter of Sir Edmund Fairfax, that she currently resided with her aunt, and that she required employment to support herself. When pressed about the nature of her departure from her father's household, she had met his eyes steadily and replied that she had become involved in a scandal that made her continued residence there impossible. She did not elaborate, did not offer excuses or explanations, and did not display either shame or self-justification. Her frankness disarmed him more effectively than any protestation of innocence might have done. The Duke had explained the position with equal directness. Lady Amelia was 16, recently orphaned, and in need of guidance from someone who could manage her behavior without breaking under the pressure of her grief and anger. The role required residence in his household, attendance upon Amelia throughout the day, supervision of her studies and social education, and most importantly, the ability to endure difficult behavior without either excessive sympathy or harsh discipline. The salary would be generous by the standards of such positions, though it would naturally preclude any possibility of Miss Fairfax moving in society or maintaining her former social connections. Diana had listened without interruption, her expression thoughtful, and when he had finished, she had asked only one question. Did His Grace genuinely believe that a woman of ruined reputation would provide suitable guidance for a young lady of quality? Her tone had been neither ironic nor challenging, merely curious, as though she were inquiring about the logic of his reasoning rather than questioning his judgment. The Duke had regarded her with something approaching approval. The question demonstrated both intelligence and self-awareness, qualities he valued above conventional deference. He had responded that he believed a woman who had experienced the consequences of scandal might provide more practical instruction than one who had lived a sheltered existence. Lady Amelia required not moral platitudes, but genuine understanding of how society functioned and what it demanded. Miss Fairfax, having lost everything society could take from a woman, possessed that understanding in ways that made her uniquely qualified for the position. Diana had considered his words in silence for several moments, her gray eyes never leaving his face, and then she had inclined her head in acceptance. She would undertake the position on one condition, that she would never be required to discuss the specifics of her own scandal with anyone, including Lady Amelia. Her past was her own, and while she would accept the consequences of it, she would not perform it as a cautionary tale for the edification of others. The Duke, surprised by both the condition and the firm manner in which it was stated, had found himself agreeing. He cared nothing for the particulars of her disgrace, only its existence and its effects mattered for his purposes. They had settled the practical arrangements with business-like efficiency, and Diana had departed Grosvenor Square with the understanding that she would take up residence in the Duke's household within the week. As Silvermere watched her retreating figure from the library window, he experienced an unfamiliar sensation that took him several moments to identify as curiosity. There was something about Miss Fairfax that did not align with his preconceptions of fallen women. She possessed neither the defiant bravado he had expected, nor the defeated submission he had anticipated. Instead, she displayed a quality he could only characterize as self-possession, as though she had made peace with her circumstances in a way that transcended either bitterness or regret. It was, he thought, an interesting quality, though he gave little consideration to how that interest might evolve into something altogether more dangerous. Diana took up residence in the Duke of Silvermere's household on a grey morning in late June, when London was preparing to empty itself of fashionable inhabitants bound for country estates and seaside resorts. She had been assigned chambers in the family wing rather than the servants' quarters, a subtle acknowledgement of her gentle birth that nonetheless emphasized her ambiguous position. The rooms were comfortable without being luxurious, furnished with pieces that had likely graced more prominent chambers before being relegated to secondary use. A small sitting room connected to a bedchamber that overlooked the Mews, far enough from the noise of the street to provide peace, but not so elevated as to suggest importance. Her first meeting with Lady Amelia Thornbury had occurred in the schoolroom, a bright chamber on the third floor that contained more books than Diana's father's entire library, and more educational apparatus than she had encountered in her own governess's collective arsenals. Amelia herself had been seated at a window seat, staring out at the square below with an expression of such profound melancholy that Diana had felt an immediate pang of sympathy. The girl possessed her uncle's pale coloring and aristocratic features, but where his face held authority, hers showed only sadness poorly concealed behind adolescent defiance. Amelia turned at Diana's entrance, her blue eyes assessing the newcomer with the frank rudeness that only 16 years could make excusable. Taking in Diana's plain gown, her simply dressed hair, her lack of fashionable accessories, the girl pronounced with devastating certainty that her uncle must truly despise her if he had hired such an unremarkable person as her governess. Diana, who had endured 3 months of whispers and cut directs from people she had once called friends, found herself unmoved by the girl's hostility. Seating herself in a chair opposite Amelia with perfect composure, she observed mildly that remarkable people seldom made effective teachers, as they tended to be too occupied with their own remarkableness to attend to their students. The response clearly surprised Amelia, who had been prepared for wounded feelings or stern reprimands. Diana pressed her advantage by inquiring what subjects Amelia enjoyed studying, and when the girl replied sullenly that she enjoyed none of them, Diana suggested they abandon formal lessons entirely for the first week and instead simply become acquainted through reading novels aloud to one another and discussing them. A young lady's education, Diana stated with perfect seriousness, should begin with discovering what captured her imagination, not with imposing upon her imagination what others decreed important. This unorthodox approach had achieved what discipline and moral lectures had failed to accomplish. It had engaged Amelia's attention. Over the following days, the two women had established a routine that bore little resemblance to conventional instruction. They read together from Amelia's extensive collection of novels, discussed the motivations of characters, debated the plausibility of plots, and gradually, almost imperceptibly, Diana had begun introducing more substantial works of history, philosophy, and literature under the guise of seeking parallels to the romantic narratives Amelia favored. The Duke, observing this progress from his position of deliberate distance, found himself reluctantly impressed by Miss Fairfax's methods. He had expected competence born of desperation. Instead, he witnessed genuine skill in managing his niece's difficult temperament. Amelia, who had terrorized 3 previous governesses, seemed almost content in Miss Fairfax's company, and the sounds of tearful outbursts and slammed doors that had previously echoed through the house had largely ceased. His interactions with Miss Fairfax herself had been limited by design. He encountered her occasionally in hallways or on the stairs, exchanged brief civilities about Amelia's progress during their weekly meetings in his library, and otherwise maintained the proper distance between employer and employee. Yet he found himself increasingly aware of her presence in his household in ways that disturbed his usual equilibrium. He noticed when she passed through a room because the servants' conversation would pause in respect. He observed that she thanked footmen who held doors and remembered scullery maids' names. He recognized in her bearing a quality of quiet dignity that seemed entirely at odds with her supposed history of scandal. It was during the 4th week of Diana's residence that the Duke's carefully maintained distance began to erode in ways he found impossible to ignore. Working late one evening in his library, reviewing correspondence from his estate managers, he heard the sound of someone moving about in the adjacent music room. Upon investigating the disturbance, he discovered Miss Fairfax seated at the pianoforte, playing with a skill and feeling that suggested years of dedicated study. The piece was one of the Beethoven sonatas, complex and emotionally demanding, and she performed it with such absorption that she did not notice his presence in the doorway. Silvermere, who prided himself on his connoisseurship of music, recognized true talent when he encountered it. Miss Fairfax played not as an accomplishment to display in drawing rooms, but as a musician who understood the architecture of the composition and the emotional landscape it navigated. When she finished, her hands remaining on the keys as though reluctant to break the connection, he spoke before considering the wisdom of doing so, remarking that Beethoven would have approved of her interpretation. Diana started at his voice, turning on the bench with an expression that combined embarrassment and defiance. She apologized for the intrusion, explaining that Amelia had mentioned the pianoforte was rarely used, and she had not imagined that playing would disturb anyone at such an hour. The Duke waved aside her apology and asked where she had acquired such proficiency. Her answer, delivered with careful neutrality, revealed that her mother had been an accomplished musician who had insisted on rigorous training for both daughters, though the expense of lessons had represented a considerable sacrifice for the family. This revelation prompted an unexpected conversation that extended well beyond the boundaries of employer and employee discourse. They discussed music, moving from Beethoven to Mozart to Handel, discovering shared preferences and divergent opinions with the ease of equals engaged in genuine exchange. The Duke found himself actually laughing, at Miss Fairfax's witty assessment of a particularly pompous performance they had both apparently attended at the King's Theatre 2 years earlier, before her fall from grace had made such attendance impossible. It was only when the library clock had chimed midnight that they had both become aware of the impropriety of the situation. An unmarried woman conversing alone with a gentleman at such an hour violated every convention, though the circumstances made it absurd. She was his employee, residing under his roof, and they were discussing music in the way scholars might debate philosophy. Yet convention cared nothing for circumstances, and both recognized the potential for misunderstanding. Diana rose with an abruptness that betrayed her awareness of transgression, offered a brief goodnight, and departed before the Duke could respond. Silvermere remained in the music room, staring at the pianoforte as though it might explain the peculiar sensation that had settled in his chest. He found himself thinking not about music, but about the intelligence in Miss Fairfax's gray eyes, the animation in her expression when she discussed something that engaged her passion, and the realization that she possessed depths of character that her circumstances had obscured. This realization proved deeply troubling. The Duke had hired Miss Fairfax because her ruined reputation made her safe, unsuitable for anything beyond her prescribed role, incapable of threatening his ordered existence. Yet he was discovering that her mind was anything but safe, that her conversation challenged rather than deferred, and that her presence in his household had begun to occupy his thoughts in ways that suggested danger of an entirely different variety. The following weeks brought a series of encounters that seemed designed by fate to undermine the Duke's resolution to maintain appropriate distance. He discovered that Miss Fairfax read widely and thoughtfully, often sitting in the library during Amelia's afternoon rest with books on subjects ranging from political philosophy to natural science. He learned that she possessed strong opinions on matters from parliamentary reform to estate management, opinions she would defend with logical arguments when challenged. He observed that she treated his servants with a respect that many ladies of quality failed to extend to their inferiors, remembering birthdays and inquiring after ailing relatives with genuine concern. Most dangerously, he began to notice inconsistencies in his assumptions about her character. A woman who had been discovered in a compromising position with a notorious libertine should surely display some evidence of reckless judgment or questionable morals. Yet Miss Fairfax conducted herself with irreproachable propriety, avoided any behavior that might be construed as flirtation, and maintained boundaries with meticulous care. She read moral philosophy with evident engagement, quoted scripture with easy familiarity, and demonstrated principles in her daily conduct that suggested either remarkable reformation or profound inconsistency with her supposed past. One afternoon in the library, when the Duke found himself unable to resist asking how a woman of evident sense and principle had come to be involved in scandal, he had regarded her with particular intensity before speaking. "Forgive my indiscretion, Miss Fairfax," he had stated with careful deliberation, "but the nature of your alleged involvement has never seemed entirely clear to me, particularly considering it supposedly involved a gentleman such as Pemberton, whose reputation for gaming debts, broken promises, and general lack of honor has been well documented in my circles." The Duke's pale eyes had held something like contempt when pronouncing the man's name, making clear his low opinion of the alleged source of her disgrace. Diana had regarded him with an expression that held neither shame nor defiance, only a kind of tired patience. She stated simply that sometimes circumstances required sacrifices that others could not comprehend, and that she had made such a sacrifice with full awareness of its consequences. She would not elaborate, would not defend herself or seek his sympathy, and the finality in her tone precluded further inquiry, though the Duke noted with interest that she had not denied the word sacrifice. Yet her answer had only intensified Silvermere's curiosity. The word sacrifice suggested nobility rather than folly, implied that her scandal might have been deliberate rather than accidental. But what sacrifice could possibly justify destroying one's own reputation? What circumstance could demand such extreme self-abnegation? The Duke found himself replaying their conversation during political meetings, during correspondence with his stewards, during the tedious social obligations that filled his evenings. The mystery of Diana Fairfax had become an obsession that he recognized as dangerous but seemed powerless to resist. Amelia, with the uncomfortable perceptiveness of youth, had begun to notice her uncle's increased attention to her governess. She had remarked during one of their lessons that His Grace seemed to smile more frequently since Miss Fairfax's arrival, and that she had observed him lingering in hallways where he might encounter them, something he had never done with previous governesses. Diana had deflected these observations with firm reminders that a young lady should not speculate about her elders, but privately she had begun to recognize the danger that Amelia's words implied. The Duke of Silvermere was showing her consideration that exceeded the requirements of their professional relationship. He sought her opinions on matters unrelated to Amelia's education. He provided her with books from his personal library without being asked. He had recently directed his housekeeper to move Diana's chambers to a better suite, with windows overlooking the garden rather than the mews. These were not the actions of a man who viewed her as merely an employee, and Diana understood with growing alarm that she had somehow become an object of interest to one of the most powerful men in England. The realization terrified her. She could not afford to entertain hopes of anything beyond her current position. She was ruined in the eyes of society, marked as a woman of questionable virtue, forever barred from the kind of alliance that a duke must make when he chose to marry. Any attachment between them could only result in her dismissal and further disgrace, or worse, in her becoming precisely the kind of woman society already believed her to be. She had sacrificed her reputation to save her sister. She would not compound that sacrifice by entertaining impossible dreams of redemption through a duke's favor. The turning point arrived with the unexpected force of summer storms that sweep across London with little warning, transforming golden afternoons into grey tempests in the space of minutes. It occurred on an August evening when the Duke had been scheduled to attend a dinner at Lord Melbourne's residence and had returned home early with complaints of a headache that his butler recognized as diplomatic illness designed to escape tedious company. Silvermere retreated to his library, seeking the solace of solitude, only to discover Diana there ahead of him, seated in his favored chair near the window, with a volume of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics open on her lap. She was so absorbed in her reading that his entrance went unnoticed, and he stood in the doorway for several moments, simply observing her. The late afternoon light cast her profile in sharp relief, illuminating the intelligence in her expression as she read, the unconscious grace of her posture, and the complete absence of artifice in her concentration. She was, he realized with the sudden clarity of revelation, beautiful in ways that had nothing to do with conventional standards and everything to do with the quality of her mind and character. When she finally sensed his presence and looked up with startled eyes, the Duke found himself unable to maintain the distance he had so carefully cultivated. Crossing to the window, he remarked upon her choice of reading material, and before either of them could construct proper barriers, they fell into conversation with the naturalness of old friends rather than employer and employee. They discussed virtue and happiness, whether moral excellence could be taught or was inherent in character, and how society's definitions of honor sometimes conflicted with genuine morality. The conversation ventured into personal territory when the Duke observed that Aristotle would have approved of someone who sacrificed personal advantage for the good of another, as such sacrifice represented the highest form of virtue. Diana's response, delivered with careful composure, was that Aristotle had never been a woman facing ruin in Regency society. The Duke laughed at this sally, and emboldened by her wit, pressed his inquiry further. He asked directly whether her scandal had indeed involved such a sacrifice, and whether she would tell him the truth if he promised never to reveal it or judge her by society's standards. Diana, meeting his eyes with an intensity that seemed to penetrate all his carefully constructed defenses, remained silent for so long that he began to regret his presumption. When she finally spoke, her voice held a quality of exhaustion that suggested the weight of months spent bearing judgment alone. She told him everything: her sister's situation, Pemberton's blackmail, the impossible choice between Harriet's future and her own reputation, and the cold calculation with which she had orchestrated her own downfall. She described the expression on her father's face when he ordered her from his house, the tears in Harriet's eyes as Diana packed her belongings, and the relief she felt, knowing that her sacrifice had achieved its purpose, when she later learned that Harriet had received an honorable offer from a young vicar and was planning a respectable wedding. As Diana spoke, Silvermere felt his entire understanding of her situation undergo a profound transformation. The ruined woman he had hired, the cautionary example he had intended to place before Amelia, dissolved with each word she uttered. In her place emerged someone entirely different, a strategist willing to sacrifice her own pieces, her very self, to win a war fought on behalf of another. Each detail of Pemberton's blackmail scheme cemented in his mind not Diana's disgrace, but the scoundrel's depravity. He watched her face as she described orchestrating her own downfall with the same methodical precision a general might employ in planning a decisive campaign, and he recognized in that moment what he had failed to perceive before. Her scandal had not been the result of poor judgment or weak character, but rather the product of extraordinary courage and selflessness. The woman before him possessed more genuine nobility than most of the hereditary peers he encountered in Parliament. When she had finished, he remained silent, not from judgment, but from the overwhelming realization that he had fundamentally misunderstood everything about her, and that his initial assessment of her character had been as wrong-headed as it was unjust. Diana, interpreting his silence through the lens of her own fears, felt the familiar sensation of dread settle over her. She had miscalculated, had trusted where trust was foolish, had revealed truths that would surely result in her dismissal. No duke, no matter how liberal his thinking, could retain in his household a woman who had deliberately courted scandal, even if her motives had been noble. But when the duke finally spoke, his words shattered all her expectations. Rising from his chair, he crossed to where she sat and took her hand in his, with a gentleness that contradicted his reputation for coldness. He told her that she possessed more genuine nobility than half the peers in the House of Lords, that her sacrifice represented precisely the kind of virtue that Aristotle had described, and that society's condemnation revealed its own moral bankruptcy rather than hers. He apologized for having hired her under false premises, for having intended to use her as an object lesson for Amelia, and for having failed to recognize her true character despite all the evidence that had been before him. Diana, who had become accustomed to judgment and rejection, had found herself unable to respond. She had sat frozen, her hand in his, feeling the warmth of his fingers and the sincerity in his voice with equal intensity. When she had finally managed to speak, her words had been inadequate to the moment. She had thanked him for his understanding and had attempted to withdraw her hand from his grasp. The Duke had not released her. Instead, he had done something that shocked them both. He had raised her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her fingers with such reverence that it seemed less like a gesture of gallantry and more like a form of worship. He had told her, his voice rough with emotion, he seemed barely able to control, that she had become essential to his household, not because of her skill with Amelia, but because of her presence in his life. He had confessed that he thought of her constantly, that he sought opportunities to encounter her in hallways and libraries, and that he had begun to understand that what he felt was not mere admiration, but something far more dangerous and profound. Diana had withdrawn her hand then, rising from her chair with such abruptness that the book of Aristotle had tumbled to the floor forgotten. She had stated with desperate firmness that whatever he felt, it could lead nowhere, that she was ruined beyond redemption, and that any attachment between them would destroy his reputation as thoroughly as hers had been destroyed. She was grateful for his understanding, honored by his good opinion, but she would not be the instrument of his social destruction. The Duke had regarded her with an expression that combined frustration and something very like admiration. He had asked whether she truly believed that he, the Duke of Silvermere, with more wealth than he could spend in 3 lifetimes and more influence than most cabinet ministers, could be destroyed by choosing to acknowledge his regard for a woman of genuine character. He had observed that society's rules meant nothing to him if they required him to pretend that Diana Fairfax was anything less than extraordinary. But Diana had shaken her head, her gray eyes bright with unshed tears. She had responded that he did not understand what he risked, that society's vengeance fell hardest on those who defied its judgments, and that she could not bear to be the cause of his diminishment. She had already sacrificed her own position to save her sister. She would not accept his sacrifice of his position for her sake. She had thanked him for his regard, had told him that she would treasure the memory of this conversation, and had fled the library before he could protest further. Silvermere had remained alone in the library long into the evening, staring at the chair where Diana had sat, at the volume of Aristotle still lying on the floor, and at his own hands that still seemed to feel the warmth of hers. He had finally acknowledged to himself what he had been avoiding for weeks. He was in love with his niece's governess, with a woman society had condemned, and he could not imagine his future without her presence in it. The realization should have been alarming. Instead, it felt like the first honest thing he had admitted to himself in years. The following days passed in a state of fragile hope that neither Diana nor the Duke dared to examine too closely. They encountered one another in hallways and libraries with heightened awareness, exchanged glances weighted with unspoken understanding, and moved through their separate routines whilst remaining acutely conscious of the other's presence. It was during this period of tentative happiness that one of the housemaids, a sensible girl named Mary, mentioned to Diana in passing that she had observed a gentleman of vaguely familiar appearance loitering at the far end of Grosvenor Square on 2 separate mornings, seeming to watch the ducal residence with particular attention. Diana, her mind occupied with more immediate concerns and her heart still adjusting to the extraordinary revelations of recent days, had given the report little consideration beyond a vague sense of unease that she attributed to her general state of heightened emotion. She had no way of knowing that shadows from her past were gathering with malicious intent, preparing to shatter the peace she had so recently begun to imagine might be hers to keep. The fragile understanding that had developed between the Duke and Diana shattered 3 days later with the unexpected arrival of Geoffrey Pemberton at the Grosvenor Square residence. Pemberton had requested an audience with His Grace on a matter of urgency, and the Duke, curious about what could bring such a creature to his door, had agreed to receive him in the library. Pemberton had entered with the easy confidence of a man who believed his charm could overcome any obstacle. He had complimented the Duke on his magnificent home, had remarked upon the fine weather, and had only gradually approached his actual purpose. It seemed, he had explained with carefully practiced regret, that he had recently learned of Miss Diana Fairfax's residence in the Duke's household. This discovery had troubled him greatly, as he felt honor-bound to inform His Grace of certain facts about the lady's character that might not have been fully disclosed during her employment negotiations. The Duke, who had been lounging in his chair with deceptive casualness, had become very still. He had invited Pemberton to elaborate, his tone suggesting polite interest, while his eyes had taken on the quality of winter ice. Pemberton, misinterpreting the Duke's reaction as encouraging, had proceeded to relate a thoroughly false version of events from the Beaumont ball. According to his account, Miss Fairfax had pursued him with increasingly obvious advances throughout the season. She had sent him letters, had arranged encounters, and had finally cornered him in the conservatory, where she had attempted to compromise him in hopes of forcing a marriage proposal. He had been attempting to extricate himself from the situation when Lady Thornbury and her companions had discovered them, and he had remained silent about Miss Fairfax's predatory behavior only out of misguided chivalry toward a woman of obvious desperation. Pemberton had concluded his tale with the observation that he felt compelled to share this information given His Grace's well-known standards of propriety. A man of the Duke's position could not afford to have his household associated with women of such questionable morals, particularly when an impressionable young lady like Lady Amelia was under the same roof. He had offered with transparent calculation to personally vouch for several highly qualified governesses of impeccable reputation should the Duke wish to make alternative arrangements for his niece's care. Silvermere had listened to this performance without expression, his pale eyes never leaving Pemberton's face, and when the man had finished, the Duke had allowed silence to extend until it became uncomfortable. Then, with a voice that could have frozen the Thames in August, he had delivered his response. He had thanked Pemberton for his concern and had observed that it was remarkably convenient how the man's version of events cast him as victim and Miss Fairfax as aggressor. He had inquired whether Pemberton had any evidence to support his claims, and when the response had been vague references to unnamed witnesses, the Duke had suggested that perhaps Pemberton himself might have reasons for wishing to destroy Miss Fairfax's reputation further. He had mentioned, almost casually, that he possessed extensive connections throughout London and that inquiries into Pemberton's financial situation and personal conduct could be arranged with remarkable efficiency. Pemberton's confidence had begun to waver under this unexpectedly hostile reception. He had attempted to laugh off the Duke's implications, had insisted that he sought only to protect his grace from imposition, and had gradually realized that he had miscalculated catastrophically. The Duke had not responded to his revelations with gratitude or alarm, but with something that resembled barely controlled rage. Silvermere had risen from his chair then, his height and presence filling the room with aristocratic authority that made Pemberton instinctively retreat toward the door. The Duke had informed him that Miss Fairfax's employment would continue at his pleasure, that her character was beyond question so far as his grace was concerned, and that if Pemberton valued his remaining social standing, he would never mention Miss Fairfax's name again in any context whatsoever. He had further suggested that Pemberton remove himself from the ducal residence immediately and consider whether his financial situation might benefit from an extended residence abroad, away from the scrutiny of certain powerful individuals who were beginning to take interest in his affairs. Pemberton had departed with considerably less confidence than he had arrived, and the Duke had spent the following hour pacing his library in fury at the man's presumption and calculation. It had become clear that Pemberton, having learned of Diana's employment, had attempted to force her dismissal through malicious slander, likely fearing that she might reveal the truth about his blackmail scheme to her powerful employer. The attempt had failed spectacularly, but it had left Silvermere with uncomfortable questions about how to protect Diana from further attacks and whether his regard for her was placing her in additional danger. What the Duke did not know, could not have anticipated, was that Diana herself had witnessed the entire encounter. She had been returning to her chambers from the schoolroom when she had passed the library door, which Pemberton's agitated departure had left slightly ajar. She had heard his voice relating his false account, had listened to every lie and distortion with growing horror, and had then heard the Duke's defense of her character with emotions too complex to name. But Diana had not remained to hear the conclusion of the conversation. Pemberton's renewed slander had awakened fears she had been suppressing since her confession to the Duke. She had believed that Silvermere's understanding meant safety, that his knowledge of the truth would protect her from further harm. Instead, Pemberton's appearance demonstrated that her past would continue to haunt her, would continue to threaten anyone who chose to associate with her. The Duke had defended her this time, but how long before his own reputation became entangled with hers? How long before society began to whisper about the Duke who kept a ruined woman in his household? How long before his political influence eroded under the weight of scandal by association? Diana returned to her chambers, her mind a battlefield of conflicting impulses. Gratitude for the Duke's defense warred with terror at what it might cost him. The memory of his voice, cold as winter frost as he had demolished Pemberton's lies, filled her with warmth that immediately curdled into guilt. He had stood for her without hesitation, had risked his own reputation to protect hers, and she knew with devastating certainty that he would do so again and again until society's relentless judgment destroyed him as thoroughly as it had destroyed her. She paced the small sitting room, her hands pressed to her temples as though physical pressure might contain the chaos of her thoughts. She loved him. The admission, no longer deniable even to herself, struck with the force of revelation. She loved Robert Thornbury with an intensity that terrified her precisely because it made her vulnerable in ways her first sacrifice never had. When she had orchestrated her own ruin to save Harriet, she had calculated the cost to herself alone. But this was different. This was watching someone she loved preparing to pay a price she had no right to ask. Her sacrifice for her sister had been difficult but clear. She had traded her future for Harriet's with eyes wide open to the exchange. But accepting the Duke's sacrifice, allowing him to damage his position for her sake, felt not like love, but like the most profound selfishness. She sat at her writing desk as afternoon shadows lengthened across the floor, staring at blank paper whilst her heart and mind waged their terrible war. Stay and watch him become entangled in her disgrace. Leave and perhaps give him the chance to forget her, to find some suitable duchess who would bring him alliance instead of scandal. The choice seemed simple in its cruelty, her happiness or his future. And Diana, who had already proven herself capable of sacrificing everything for those she loved, knew with aching certainty which path honor demanded she take. Diana spent the afternoon making a decision that felt like tearing out her own heart. She could not remain in the Duke's household. Her presence endangered Amelia's prospects, threatened Silvermere's position, and served as a constant target for men like Pemberton who sought to profit from her disgrace. She loved the Duke, though she had never admitted it even to herself until these last terrible hours, and precisely because she loved him, she could not allow him to sacrifice his standing for her sake. Her sacrifice for Harriet had been necessary. She would not permit the Duke to make a similar sacrifice for her. She had written a letter of resignation that evening, stating simply that she could no longer continue in her position and would be departing the following morning for her aunt's home. She had written a separate note to Amelia, explaining that sometimes circumstances required difficult choices and that she trusted the girl had learned enough to continue her own education with wisdom and grace. She had placed both letters on the library desk after midnight when she knew the Duke would be asleep, and she had packed her few belongings with hands that trembled despite her determination. Dawn found Diana at the servants' entrance, her small trunk beside her, waiting for the hackney coach she had arranged to collect her. She had not slept, had spent the night alternating between certainty that she was doing the right thing and despair at leaving behind the first place she had felt valued since her sacrifice. She loved Amelia with an affection that had surprised her, admired the household staff who had treated her with kindness, and loved the Duke with an intensity that frightened her precisely because it felt so fundamental to her being. What Diana could not know, as she stood in the grey London dawn waiting for her departure, was that the Duke had discovered her letters an hour earlier, during his habitual early morning review of correspondence. He had read her resignation with disbelief that had rapidly transformed into fury at what he perceived as her lack of faith in his ability to protect her. He had immediately dispatched footmen to prevent her departure, had ordered his carriage prepared, and was even now descending the stairs with the intention of stopping her from making what he considered a catastrophic mistake. The confrontation that followed would have provided gossip for every drawing room in London had anyone been present to witness it. The Duke, still in his shirt sleeves with no coat or cravat, had emerged into the courtyard where Diana waited just as the hackney coach rounded the corner into view. His appearance, so thoroughly improper for a man of his rank, had shocked her into immobility. The morning air was sharp and cold against her skin, carrying with it the smell of coal smoke and damp stone that characterized London dawns. Silvermere dismissed the approaching coach with a gesture and a coin that made the driver depart with alacrity and no questions. The sharp sound of his boots striking the damp cobblestones echoed through the courtyard as he turned to Diana with an expression that combined anger and something very like anguish. He demanded to know by what right she presumed to make decisions about his reputation without consulting him. He insisted that if anyone would determine whether her presence endangered his position, it would be himself, not her misguided sense of martyrdom. He stated, with a force that seemed to reverberate off the surrounding buildings, that he was not some green boy who required protection from society's censure, and that he would thank her to credit him with sufficient intelligence to understand the consequences of his own choices. Diana, who had prepared herself for dignified departure but not for confrontation, responded with equal heat that she was protecting not only his reputation, but his future. A duke needed to marry appropriately, needed to produce heirs with impeccable lineage, needed to maintain political alliances that depended on social acceptance. She could offer him none of these things. She was ruined, marked, forever barred from the kind of alliance his position demanded. Her departure was not martyrdom, but simple recognition of reality. Her breath formed small clouds in the cold air as she spoke, each word a visible testament to her resolve. The Duke's response was to inform her, in terms that left no room for misunderstanding, that he had no intention of marrying anyone else, that her lineage was entirely acceptable given her father's baronetcy, and that any heirs they might produce together would be more than adequately noble, given that their mother possessed a character superior to most of the current peerage. He stated, his voice dropping to something like tenderness despite his evident frustration, that he loved her, that he intended to marry her, and that the only thing preventing their immediate engagement was her stubborn conviction that she understood his needs better than he did himself. Diana found herself suddenly unable to breathe, unable to think, unable to do anything but stare at the Duke of Silvermere standing in his courtyard in his shirt sleeves, declaring his intention to marry a ruined governess. The impossibility of the moment overwhelmed her, and she did something she had not done since her father had expelled her from his home. She began to weep. Not delicate tears that could be dismissed as feminine sensibility, but great wrenching sobs that shook her entire frame and spoke to months of suppressed grief, fear, and loneliness. Silvermere, confronted with Diana's tears, abandoned all pretense of aristocratic reserve. He crossed the courtyard in 3 long strides, pulled her into his arms with no regard for propriety or witnesses, and held her while she wept against his chest. The warmth of him enveloped her, a sharp contrast to the morning chill, and her sobs became muffled against the fine linen of his shirt. He stroked her hair with one hand whilst the other pressed her closer, murmuring reassurances that she barely comprehended, simply providing the comfort and security she had been denied since her sacrifice had severed her from family and society. She could feel the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek, an anchor in the storm of her emotions. When Diana had finally regained some measure of composure, she had attempted to explain that marriage was impossible, that society would never accept her as his duchess, that he would face opposition from his family and censure from his peers. But the Duke had silenced her protests with a gesture, had gently wiped the tears from her face, and had told her that he had already made his decision. The only question remaining was whether she loved him enough to accept his choice, or whether her pride would condemn them both to lonely, proper, miserable existences apart. Diana had looked into his pale gray eyes, had seen the determination and tenderness there, and had finally allowed herself to hope. She had whispered that she did love him, that she had loved him probably from that first evening in the music room when he had laughed at her irreverent assessment of the opera, and that she was terrified by the strength of that love precisely because it made her vulnerable in ways her sacrifice never had. The Duke of Silvermere's declaration in the courtyard would have been sufficiently scandalous had it remained private, but fate, with its characteristic sense of irony, had ensured an audience. Lady Amelia, awakened by the unusual commotion below her window, had witnessed the entire scene from her chambers. The staff, arriving for their morning duties, had observed their master embracing the governess with an intimacy that left no doubt about the nature of his feelings. By the time Diana and the Duke had retreated to the library to discuss their situation with more privacy and propriety, the news had traveled through the servants' quarters faster than a dispatch from the Admiralty, reaching every corner of the establishment within the hour. Mrs. Henderson, the housekeeper who had served the Thornberry family for 30 years, had taken it upon herself to inform His Grace that while the staff held Miss Fairfax in the highest regard, the situation required immediate resolution to prevent further scandal. She had suggested, with the kind of forthright advice that long service made permissible, that the Duke either marry Miss Fairfax with all haste or arrange for her departure to prevent gossip from spreading beyond the household. Silvermere, who had spent the morning in the library with Diana, attempting to formulate a plan that would navigate between his desires and social reality, had received this advice with grim acknowledgement. He understood that his public embrace of Diana had created a situation that demanded immediate action. If he did nothing, her reputation would be further destroyed by association with him. If he married her quietly in some country church, society would interpret it as an irregular connection barely legitimized. The only solution that preserved Diana's honor and made clear his intentions was a public engagement announced with all the formality his position commanded. The difficulty lay in the fact that such an announcement would immediately provoke the opposition he had dismissed so cavalierly in the courtyard. His aunt, the Dowager Duchess of Silvermere, maintained significant influence in society and had been planning his eventual marriage to a suitable heiress for years. His political allies expected him to reinforce their connections through matrimonial alliances with their families. His friends among the ton would be shocked by his choice of a woman who had been publicly ruined, regardless of the circumstances that had led to her disgrace. Diana, understanding these obstacles with painful clarity, had urged him to reconsider. She had suggested alternative arrangements. She could remain in his household as Amelia's governess. They could maintain a private understanding, and perhaps in several years when the memory of her scandal had faded, they might revisit the possibility of a more public acknowledgement. But Silvermere had rejected these compromises with the decisiveness that made him formidable in political negotiations. He would not ask Diana to remain in an ambiguous position, would not insult her by suggesting a secret arrangement, and would not wait for society's permission to marry the woman he loved. He had formulated a plan that was characteristically bold and absolutely typical of his approach to obstacles. He would confront society's prejudices directly by exposing the truth about Diana's sacrifice. If the ton understood that her scandal had been deliberate self-destruction undertaken to save her sister from blackmail, they would be forced to reassess their condemnation. The difficulty would be obtaining proof of Pemberton's scheme and Harriet's innocence without further endangering Diana's sister, who was now respectably married and presumably safe from renewed scandal. It was Amelia who had provided the key to solving this difficulty. The girl, who had developed genuine affection for Diana over the months of her residence, had approached her uncle with information she had been concealing out of loyalty to her governess. During one of their lessons, Diana had received a letter from her sister that had clearly caused her distress. Amelia, concerned and curious, had noticed the letter left briefly unattended on Diana's desk and had seen enough of its contents to understand that Harriet possessed the original blackmail letters that Pemberton had threatened to expose. Diana's sister had apparently written expressing regret that her marriage had been purchased through her sister's sacrifice and offering to provide the evidence that might restore Diana's reputation. Armed with this information, the Duke had immediately dispatched his most trusted investigator to make contact with Mrs. Harriet Wilson, née Fairfax, in her Hampshire parsonage. The instructions had been explicit: obtain the letters from Harriet, secure her testimony about Pemberton's blackmail scheme, and offer whatever assurances were necessary to guarantee that her own reputation would remain protected throughout the process of exposing the truth. Mrs. Wilson, when approached, had been initially reluctant to involve herself in what might become public scandal. Her husband, the Reverend James Wilson, was a genuinely good man who knew nothing of the circumstances that had preceded their marriage, and she feared what disclosure might do to his opinion of her and their standing in their community. But when informed that the Duke of Silvermere himself sought this information for the purpose of marrying her sister and restoring Diana's honor, Harriet had overcome her reluctance. She had provided not only Pemberton's original blackmail letters, but also her own detailed account of his threats and demands, written with the obvious hope that it might somehow aid her sister. The Duke had used this evidence with the strategic precision of a general planning a military campaign. He had first approached Pemberton directly, confronting him with the blackmail letters and Harriet's testimony in the presence of two witnesses from his legal team. He had offered Pemberton a choice: confess publicly to the blackmail scheme and Diana's innocence, or face prosecution for extortion and possible transportation. The alternative had been made clear. The Duke possessed sufficient influence to ensure that Pemberton would never be received in polite society again, and sufficient determination to pursue charges that would lead to prison or worse. Pemberton, confronted with irrefutable evidence and a Duke who clearly meant every word of his threats, had capitulated with the cowardice that characterized his entire existence. He had agreed to sign a confession detailing his blackmail of Harriet, Diana's deliberate self-sacrifice to protect her sister, and his own subsequent attempts to further destroy Diana's reputation through malicious slander. The document, witnessed and notarized, represented a complete vindication of Diana's character and an absolute condemnation of Pemberton's conduct. But the Duke had not been satisfied with a private confession. He understood that Diana's restoration required public acknowledgement, that whispers in drawing rooms needed to be silenced with official declarations. He had therefore arranged for Pemberton's confession to be published in the Morning Post and the Times, had ensured that copies were delivered to every patroness of Almack's, and had made certain that the confession reached the attention of the Prince Regent himself through carefully cultivated channels at Carlton House. The reaction had been immediate and dramatic. Society, which had condemned Diana with such alacrity, now rushed to praise her sacrifice with equal enthusiasm. The same women who had cut her in the street now proclaimed that they had always suspected something noble in her demeanor. The same gentlemen who had smirked at her disgrace now declared that Miss Fairfax represented the finest example of sisterly devotion. The Tun, faced with incontrovertible evidence and the Duke of Silvermere's obvious approval, performed the remarkable feat of completely reversing its judgment while pretending it had never held a contrary opinion. Sir Edmund Fairfax, reading Pemberton's confession in his Bloomsbury parlour, had experienced a transformation of understanding that left him shaken and ashamed. His daughter, whom he had expelled from his home with such righteous fury, had deliberately sacrificed herself to save her sister from a scoundrel's machinations. She had endured his condemnation, society's censure, and months of poverty rather than reveal the truth that would have endangered Harriet. The words on the page forced him to confront what, in the depths of his soul, he had never quite been able to silence. A persistent voice insisting that the accusation had never truly aligned with the character of the daughter he had raised. But his wounded pride and the crushing weight of society's judgment had blinded him to the truth his heart had refused to completely deny. He had written to Diana immediately, his letter a mixture of apology, remorse, and desperate hope for reconciliation, confessing that some part of him had always known, and that his greatest shame lay not in her supposed disgrace, but in his failure to trust what he had known of her character. Diana, reading her father's letter in the Duke's library, had found herself unable to respond with either anger or immediate forgiveness. The pain of his rejection remained too fresh, the memory of his face contorted with fury too vivid. But she had not thrown the letter away, and when Silvermere had gently suggested that families were complicated entities worthy of patience even when they failed us, she had admitted that perhaps, in time, she might find her way to forgiveness. The Dowager Duchess of Silvermere's response to her nephew's intentions had been predictably hostile. She had arrived at Grosvenor Square in a state of high indignation, had demanded a private audience with the Duke, and had proceeded to deliver a comprehensive lecture on family duty, social responsibility, and the absolute necessity of making an appropriate matrimonial alliance. Silvermere had listened with the patience of a man who had anticipated every argument and remained unmoved by all of them. When his aunt had finally exhausted her objections, he had informed her that he would marry Miss Fairfax within the month, that her approval, while desired, was not required, and that if she wished to maintain her position in his household and her influence in his affairs, she would not only accept his decision, but actively support it. The Dowager, who had not become a powerful figure in society by failing to recognize when a battle was lost, assessed her nephew's determination with the calculating eye of a strategist rather than the wounded pride of a defeated adversary. Before responding, She had demanded the full particulars of Miss Fairfax's history, and upon learning the details of Diana's deliberate self-sacrifice to protect her sister, the dowager had fallen silent, processing the information with visible calculation. A self-sacrifice to protect family, she murmured, more to herself than to her nephew, her fingers tapping thoughtfully against the arm of her chair. The story was perilously melodramatic, the sort of tale that could either elevate or destroy, depending on how it was presented. She had then looked at Silvermere with new assessment in her eyes, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Very well," she had announced with the decisiveness of a general committing to battle. "If you insist upon this course, Robert, we shall ensure it is a triumph rather than a catastrophe. No one opposes a heroine, and I shall make certain that society understands precisely what manner of woman you have chosen." She had then requested an introduction to Miss Fairfax, had spent an hour in private conversation with Diana, during which she had apparently concluded that the young woman possessed not only the qualities worthy of respect, but the backbone necessary to survive as a duchess, and had emerged from the interview announcing that the Duke had chosen with exceptional wisdom, and that she would personally ensure Miss Fairfax's acceptance in the highest circles of society. What had appeared as capitulation was, in truth, a masterful appropriation of the narrative, turning potential scandal into a romantic triumph that would enhance rather than diminish the family's standing. The formal announcement of the engagement between His Grace the Duke of Silvermere and Miss Diana Fairfax appeared in the Morning Post on the 1st of September 1816, accompanied by a brief but pointed reference to Pemberton's confession and Miss Fairfax's complete vindication. The Tun, ever attentive to shifts in power and favor, understood immediately that opposition to the match would be both futile and dangerous, given the Duke's obvious determination and the Dowager's support. The engagement precipitated a series of social events designed to reintroduce Diana to society under the protection of the Duke's name and the Dowager's formidable patronage. Lady Silvermere hosted a reception at the Grosvenor Square residence that was attended by virtually every person of consequence in London who had not yet departed for the country. Diana, dressed in a gown of rose silk that the Dowager had insisted upon purchasing, stood beside the Duke receiving congratulations from the same people who had condemned her months earlier. The rich scent of beeswax candles and expensive perfumes filled the air, so vastly different from the smell of mothballs and lavender that had permeated her remended gowns during those months of exile. The murmur of conversation that had once ceased whenever she entered a room now transformed into whispers of admiration, as guests remarked upon her composure and the Duke's evident devotion. She watched as Lady Thornbury herself, the very woman whose discovery of her in the conservatory had sealed her initial disgrace, approached with a smile that was almost apologetic, dipping into a curtsy that acknowledged Diana's new position with unmistakable respect. Diana received each gesture with expressions that betrayed neither bitterness nor triumph, only a kind of quiet dignity that impressed even her harshest former critics. The patronesses of Almack's, in a gesture clearly orchestrated by the Dowager, had sent a formal note restoring Diana's vouchers and expressing their certainty that the entire unfortunate misunderstanding had been resolved to everyone's satisfaction. Diana, who understood the pragmatic nature of this olive branch, had accepted graciously while privately acknowledging to the Duke that society's forgiveness meant less to her than it once might have done. She had learned, through her months of exile, that reputation rested on foundations far more fragile than character, and that the opinions of those who judged without knowledge mattered less than the regard of those who understood truth. Sir Edmund had been invited to the engagement reception, and the meeting between father and daughter after their months of estrangement had been awkward and painful for both. He had attempted apologies that sounded hollow even to his own ears, had offered explanations about shock and social pressure that Diana had received with polite detachment. But when he had finally simply stated that he had been wrong and that he was profoundly sorry for the pain he had caused her, Diana had found herself able to embrace him with something approaching forgiveness. The breach would take time to heal completely, but the possibility of eventual reconciliation now existed where before there had been only hurt and anger. Harriet had traveled from Hampshire with her husband, and the reunion between the sisters had been marked by tears and laughter in equal measure. Harriet had expressed guilt and gratitude in overwhelming waves until Diana had firmly insisted that no gratitude was necessary between sisters who loved one another. The Reverend Wilson, informed by his wife of the entire history, had proven to be a man of genuine Christian charity who expressed only admiration for Diana's sacrifice and relief that justice had finally been served. Lady Amelia, watching these reunions and reconciliations from her position of privileged observation, had remarked to her uncle that Miss Fairfax's story would make an excellent novel if anyone could be convinced that such events actually occurred in real life. The Duke, with the first genuine smile his niece had seen him display freely since her arrival in his household, had responded that reality frequently exceeded fiction in both dramatic intensity and improbability. The wedding itself had been planned for the first week of October at St. George's in Hanover Square, with a ceremony attended by enough members of the aristocracy and political establishment to make clear the Duke's absolute confidence in his choice. The Dowager had overseen the arrangements with military precision, ensuring that every detail reflected the dignity of the occasion and the complete social restoration of the bride. On the morning of her wedding, Diana had stood in her chambers at Grosvenor Square being attended by a small army of maids, supervised by Mrs. Henderson, wearing a gown of white silk embroidered with silver thread that made her look like something from a fairy tale. But as she studied her reflection in the looking-glass, what struck her was not her transformation from ruined woman to duchess-to-be, but the peace in her own expression. She had made her sacrifice willingly, had endured her exile with as much grace as she could muster, and had somehow emerged from that darkness into a happiness she had never imagined possible. The ceremony itself had passed in a blur of sacred words, familiar faces, and overwhelming emotion. Diana had spoken her vows with steady voice and clear conviction, had felt the Duke's hands tremble slightly as he placed the ring upon her finger, and had looked into his pale gray eyes to see reflected there the same mixture of love, relief, and wonder that she felt in her own heart. The wedding breakfast at Grosvenor Square had been attended by 300 guests who consumed champagne and praised the bride with enthusiasm that ranged from genuine to political, depending on their relationship with the groom. Toasts had been offered celebrating the union, praising the bride's character, and predicting happiness for the couple with the kind of formulaic good wishes that tradition demanded. But the moment that Diana would remember most clearly occurred late in the afternoon, when most of the guests had departed, and she found herself alone with her husband in the music room where they had first truly conversed. Silvermere had led her to the pianoforte, had seated her at the bench, and had asked her to play the Beethoven sonata he had first heard her perform months earlier. Diana had played with fingers that still trembled slightly from emotion and exhaustion, but as the music filled the room, she felt something settle in her chest that she recognized as belonging. She was no longer the Leona, fighting alone to protect those she loved. She was the Duchess of Silvermere, with a partner who valued her character above social convention, who understood sacrifice because he was willing to make it himself, and who loved her not despite her history, but because of the strength it had revealed. When she finished playing, the Duke had drawn her up from the bench and into his arms with a tenderness that made her throat tighten with emotion. He had told her that he had known from that first evening in this room that she was extraordinary, though he had fought against acknowledging it. He had confessed that falling in love with her had been both the most frightening and the most inevitable thing he had ever experienced. And he had promised her that whatever challenges they faced, they would face them together, with the kind of partnership that transcended convention and social expectation. Diana had responded that she had never imagined finding happiness after her sacrifice, that she had accepted her fate as the price of protecting Harriet, and that his love felt like a gift she had done nothing to deserve. But the Duke had gently corrected her. She had done everything to deserve happiness by being willing to sacrifice it. Character, he had observed, was revealed not in moments of ease, but in moments of crisis, and her character had proven worthy of his highest regard. In the months that followed, the Duke and his new Duchess became known throughout London for their partnership in causes that extended beyond their own happiness. They had used Silvermere's influence and wealth to establish a discreet fund for young women facing blackmail or coercion, providing them with legal assistance and financial support to resist manipulation. They had quietly arranged for Geoffrey Pemberton's departure to the colonies after his confession had made London uninhabitable for him, ensuring that he could not threaten other vulnerable women. Lady Amelia, under Diana's continued guidance and with the security of knowing her guardian had found happiness, had blossomed into a young woman of genuine character and substance. She maintained close correspondence with her aunt, whom she had begun calling by her first name at Diana's gentle insistence, and she declared with adolescent certainty that she would never marry unless she found someone who understood her as well as Uncle Robert understood Aunt Diana. Sir Edmund, gradually reconciled with his daughter through patient correspondence and occasional visits, had been restored to something approximating his former position in Diana's affections, though their relationship remained marked by the memory of his rejection. The reconciliation was imperfect but real, a testament to Diana's capacity for forgiveness and her father's genuine remorse. Harriet and her husband remained in Hampshire, where the Reverend Wilson's parish benefited from the Duke's discreet patronage. The sisters maintained close correspondence, with Harriet regularly expressing gratitude that Diana would gently discourage and affection that Diana would enthusiastically return. On a December evening, some 3 months after their marriage, Diana and Robert sat together in the music room that had become their private sanctuary, watching snow fall over the London gardens beyond the windows. Diana had been reading, while Robert reviewed parliamentary papers, and the comfortable silence between them spoke of intimacy that required no constant conversation to sustain it. When Diana finally spoke, her voice was thoughtful. She observed that she had spent months believing her sacrifice had cost her everything, only to discover that it had ultimately led her to something more valuable than what she had lost. She had sacrificed reputation and found character. She had lost social position and gained genuine love. She had given up security and discovered strength she had not known she possessed. Robert, setting aside his papers to give her his full attention, had responded that sacrifice made from love was never truly sacrifice, but rather investment in what mattered most. She had invested in her sister's happiness and had somehow, improbably, found her own in the process. He had added that her willingness to sacrifice her own future had paradoxically made her worthy of a future far better than conventional respectability could have provided. Diana had smiled at his philosophical analysis, had left her chair to settle beside him, and had observed that perhaps the greatest irony was that society's condemnation, which had felt like destruction, had actually freed her from caring what society thought. She had learned that approval based on appearance meant nothing, that judgment without knowledge revealed more about the judge than the judged, and that true worth resided in actions taken when no one was watching and no reward was expected. The Duke had drawn her close, had pressed a kiss to her temple, and had murmured that she had taught him lessons as valuable as any she had learned. He had spent years maintaining perfect propriety, caring deeply about society's opinion, and believing that his position required certain sacrifices of personal happiness. She had shown him that genuine nobility meant having the courage to defy convention when convention demanded cruelty, and that the strongest positions were those built on character rather than compromise. As the snow continued to fall and the fire crackled in the grate, the Duke and Duchess of Silvermere sat together in their music room, two people who had found each other through the most improbable circumstances imaginable. She had been branded a ruined woman for an act of supreme nobility. He had seen through her supposed disgrace to recognize her true worth. Together, they had defied society's judgments and had created something that transcended the narrow definitions of acceptable conduct. The Leona had found her lion, and in doing so, had discovered that love, when it was genuine and freely given, possessed the power to redeem even the most deliberate sacrifice. Society had attempted to destroy her. Instead, it had inadvertently placed her exactly where she needed to be, to find not just restoration, but transformation. And in the end, that transformation had changed not only Diana, but the cold duke who had hired her, proving that sometimes the greatest love stories emerged from the darkest circumstances, and that true nobility resided not in titles or estates, but in the courage to choose character over convention, love over propriety, and truth over appearance. And so, another tale of hearts united reaches its blessed conclusion. Love, it seems, finds a way even through the strictest conventions of proper society,